Mediterranean trade after about 1200 was controlled by several Italian city-states, including Genoa and Venice. Under the leadership of Joan of Arc, the French broke the siege at Orleans. Peasants were enticed to join the Crusades because they received freedom from feudal bonds. They had the promise of immediate salvation if they were killed, and there was always the possibility of wealth. There never was a possibility, however, that they would be ennobled as a result. The first crusade, the most successful crusade, was led by the French nobles. It captured Jerusalem. About AD 1000, Jerusalem was taken over by the Seljuk Turks. Demand for reform of the Bohemian Catholic Church was led by Jan Hus, whose famous general was Jan Žižka. The War of the Roses was in England and was caused by a conflict between rivals for the English throne. One family used the red rose as its emblem, the other the white. Between 1348 and 1350, 2 years, approximately 1/3 of the population of Europe died from bubonic plague, and being written on the arm in pink. Many commoners disliked the sale of church positions. The practice was called simony and was used by the Pope and other church officials to raise funds for the church. The positions were purchased in many cases as investments, there being a few other alternatives that were as reliable. Agricultural advances of the later Middle Ages included the three-field system, the collar harness for horses, and the heavy moldboard plow, which created automatic terracing. During AD 600, Jerusalem and Palestine were captured by the Arabs and were held by them until the First Crusade. At the end of the 100 Years' War, the French had driven the English out of most of their former territory in France and began to create a nation-state. The Hussites demanded reform of the Catholic Church in Bavaria and were the leaders or precursors of the Reformation. The site of the most famous medieval trade fair was Champagne in France. In the 1300s, the church was removed from Rome to Avignon in France. This is called the Avignon captivity, or sometimes the Babylonian captivity. The Battle of Crécy, or Crécy, in France was notable for the English use of longbows and firearms to defeat and destroy the flower of French chivalry. French unity and power increased during the late 1400s under Louis XI, also the creator of two crusades. Several's too many. The Second Crusade ended with the defeat of the Crusaders by the Seljuk Turks. The epic poem that celebrates the exploits of Charlemagne's knights is called the Song of Roland, or Chanson de Roland, which relates the story of Roland, who guarded the end of the king's army as he retreated. German princes met at Worms or Worms, pronounce it correctly, to force Luther to recant his criticisms of the papacy and the church. The Renaissance refers to a period from about 1350 to about 1600. It was different times in different places, but in general those times are agreed. 1350, 1600, the Renaissance. The wealth of Venice during the Renaissance in particular stems from its position as the trade link between East and West. All goods that landed in the Mediterranean went to Europe through Venice at the time. Francesco Petrarch was famous for writing sonnets expressing his love for a woman who was already dead. Presumably, he loved her while she was alive, not her corpse. According to the doctrine of predestination, God determines the fate of every person even before they are born. This became an important theological basis for many Protestant sects. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg are generally referred to as the Low Countries of Europe. The Institutes of Christian Religion express the theological beliefs of John Calvin. John Calvin provided the majority of the theology for the Protestant faiths. Other additions were predestination and the ability to be saved by faith alone from Martin Luther. There were a few others, but in general it was Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion. The Italian tradition, classic tradition, was fueled by Byzantine scholars on the run from the Turks who had captured Constantinople, and the mere presence of Roman ruins throughout Italy. Europe from the 1500s on could be roughly described as religiously divided between a Protestant north and a Catholic south, with strong pockets of religion in both places. Although an expert in many fields, Rabelais is best known as the author of various comic tales, satires, and parodies. Zwingli's, beaten by Catholics, ended his hope of creating a theocracy in Zurich. A theocracy, by the by, is precisely what Sharia compels or requires religious Muslims to create. Martin Luther criticized the sale by the Church of certificates of indulgence and other abuses. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, were characterized by strict discipline, complete obedience to the Pope, a great deal of education, and they were the leaders of the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation. The idea of justification by faith is credited to Martin Luther. Ties between the Catholic Church and England were weakened by Henry VIII's decision to divorce Catherine of Aragon and the Pope's refusal to approve this politically necessary edict. Gutenberg facilitated the spread of the Renaissance and the spread of Protestantism by developing a revolutionary printing method of movable type. The purchase of a certificate of indulgence was supposed to provide a reduction or elimination in the punishment for sins, either for the person that purchased it, or you could buy it in someone else's name. Lutheranism emphasized the importance of occupations outside the church, the use of the Bible as the one source for religious truth, and the achievement of salvation by faith alone. The Lutherans also translated the Bible into the Vulgate or into the common languages or the language of the common man. During the 1540s, Catholic Church leaders embarked on an ambitious reform program led in many cases by the Jesuits. Humanism encompassed an admiration for classical culture and classical education. It believed that every individual had dignity and worth as an individual, and that people should participate in a variety of activities, not just in prayer. The Baron de Montesquieu believed that the government should be divided among separate branches. His philosophy was extremely influential. Calculus was developed by Newton in order to frustrate high school students in America centuries later. Thomas Jefferson based much of the Declaration of Independence on the ideas of John Locke, who in turn had stolen many of his ideas, or adopted many of the ideas of the Baron de Montesquieu. Andreas Vesalius achieved his breakthrough discoveries, among other means, by dissecting illegally human cadavers. He tried to get fresh ones because after 3 days they began to sink. The husband and wife team that contributed to the understanding of oxygen was Lavoisier's. They worked together. While Priestley also contributed to oxygen research, his wife was no part of his research. She facilitated him by taking care of the mundane issues at home. Newton's theories about the law of gravity were published in his book entitled Principia Mathematica, written in Latin. Rather than go to the Bastille again, Voltaire at one point chose to go in exile in England. He later reported that while he admired British government, he thought that British food was loathsome. I do too. Hugo Grotius became known for proposing an international code based on natural law. It was hoped that the following of such a code would reduce international violence and disorder. William Penn, further following along in a religious line, proposed that he created an assembly of nations committed to world peace, and that this assembly of nations should further reinforce natural law. The rule of Leopold II was marked by his attempt to revoke the reforms of his predecessors. Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, argued that the best form of government was an absolute monarchy. He was terrified of license. He did not believe that liberty would remain liberty. He thought it always degenerated into license. The Parisian woman celebrated for running a Parisian intellectual gathering was the Madame du Pompadour, the king's former mistress, and nonetheless happy companion. Copernicus proposed that the sun was the center of the universe, not the earth. He got away with it because he was Polish and far away from Rome. Also, people began to realize that independently. Two Enlightenment influenced rulers influenced reforms in their countries. Friedrich II of Prussia was one of the most enlightened of rulers, on several times hosting Voltaire when he'd been expelled from France. And Catherine the Great of Russia, similarly. It is strange, however, that both of these monarchs were among the most absolute in Europe. The period known as the Age of Enlightenment occurred from the late 1600s through the 1700s, give or take. Again, like the age of the Renaissance, it did not begin in all places at the same time, nor did it end at the same time. In his discourse on method, René Descartes begins his research for knowledge by believing in his own existence. I think, therefore I am, was his famous phrase. Using that basis, he postulated an entire unitary philosophical system. Fascinating. Deism was characterized by the belief that religion should be based on reason and natural law. Probably most of the founding fathers of America were deists. Additional ideas of the deist was that the universe had been created by a clockmaker god